Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, wherever you may be. Welcome to ITIF's webinar called National Grades for the UN Climate Summit, Who Contributes the Most to Global Energy Innovation? My name is David Hart. I run the Center for Clean Energy Innovation here at ITIF. ITIF is a nonprofit, nonpartisan research organization based in Washington, D.C. It was ranked #1 in the world on science and technology policy, and it covers a wide range of topics in that area. I'm going to share a new report that I co-authored. First, though, I want to welcome Vijay Vaitiswaran, who's going to moderate today's discussion. Vijay is the Global Energy and Climate Editor at The Economist and host of its new podcast called To a Lesser Degree. He will briefly introduce our panelists, then I'll present the report, and we will move forward from there. Vijay, I'm really pleased that you're with us today. Let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, David. It's a great pleasure to be with you all on my favorite topic, which is innovation, and in particular, as we think about the run-up to the COP summit in Glasgow coming up, how the world can cope with extreme climate change. The role that innovation can play is vital. Even though John Kerry got into some hot water for saying this, we all know that innovation has to play an important role going forward. What is the right role? What is the tension with scaling up existing technologies, with developing new technologies to prepare for the extremes of climate change and hopefully for taming those? That's the subject of intense global conversation. I think this report makes an important contribution to that, and we're going to unpack it in the course of our time together. I'm really delighted to say we have two wonderful experts to help us with this, in addition to David himself. We have Amy Myers-Jaffe, who's the Managing Director of the Climate Policy Lab and a research professor at the Fletcher School at Tufts University. She previously served as Senior Fellow at the Council on Foreign Relations, among many other achievements, and I've known Amy for a couple of decades, and I'm delighted that she's here with us today. And Peter Schneering is the founder of the Future Clean Tech Architects, a collective of experts working to increase the success rate of breakthrough clean tech R&D. He has served as a consultant both at the UNFCCC Secretariat in Bonn and the International Energy Agency in Paris, and will bring us a very valuable European and global perspective to this topic. So welcome to you, Amy and Peter. We'll turn to you in a moment for both your responses to the report as well as your own thoughts from your own research and experience on the way forward. But let me now turn back to David to hear more about the report. Tell us, what have you found?
Actually, Vijay, I think we'll have a switch of the program and go ahead and let our keynote speaker, who's with us now, Varun Sivaram, join us. So if you wouldn't mind introducing him.
Of course. Oh, fantastic.
Yep.
Varun,
sorry
welcome.
for the confusion.
I'm so pleased you're here with us. Wonderful. We weren't sure exactly what time you joined, so we're so delighted to have you with us. It's a great honor to have you. Let me introduce you properly. Varun Sivaram, he's currently a senior advisor to U.S. Special Presidential Envoy for Climate. Prior to joining Envoy Kerry, he was the Chief Technology Officer for Renew Power, one of India's largest renewable energy companies. And he's, of course, best known around these parts for his work when he was a senior fellow at ITIF, leading the writing of the 2020 volume, Energizing America, which helped set the agenda for the Biden administration's energy policy. And of course, he's written a fantastic book about solar energy that I recommend to all of you. Varun, over to you.
Thanks so much, Vijay, and thank you, David and ITIF for the invitation and the terrific event. I have very fond memories of working with David and ITIF, and want to commend ITIF on the new report. As we'll get into, look, we've got work to do from the point of view of the United States, but I think the Biden administration has made it very clear that the United States is up to the task. Why don't I do the following? I'll give kind of an overview of how we are thinking about the overall U.S. climate strategy heading into Glasgow, which starts very soon, within 2 weeks, and we'll all be over there for the next 2 weeks. And then jump into how innovation in particular is a linchpin of our strategy. As Secretary Kerry, for whom I work, I'm his Senior Director for Clean Energy, as Secretary Kerry has made clear, Glasgow is an incredible opportunity for the world to come together, but it will be a success if we can bring major economies to the table to make commitments of increased climate ambition. And so that's what we've done for the last 9 months. Secretary Kerry has traveled around the world more times than I can count, working with world leaders, energy ministers, climate ministers, to bring enhanced nationally determined contributions to the table. And we're proud to report that when President Biden convened the Leaders Summit on Climate within 100 days of taking office, 55% of the world, measured by GDP, came forward with climate commitments, NDCs, that put us on track to keep alive the goal of 1.5 degrees Celsius by this century, keeping alive the goal of limiting warming to that temperature range and achieving a net zero transition by 2050. Of course, that leaves 45% of the world's GDP left to bring on board by the COP, but there's intense efforts underway to do it. The critical enabler that will make it possible for countries to raise their ambition is technology. President Biden has said raising our innovation ambition makes it possible for the world to raise its climate ambition. And Secretary Kerry will often say that in addition to what we have to urgently do this decade in terms of deployment, we need to build the world's biggest solar farm every single day between now and 2030. We have to ramp up renewables by 4x to a terawatt a year by 2030. In addition to the urgent deployment this decade, there's also an urgency in innovation to meet our climate challenge. It's equally important because by 2050, achieving that net zero target will require roughly half of the emissions reductions to come from technologies that haven't yet reached commercial markets or aren't ready for commercial markets yet today. And they are, for example, concentrated in hard to abate sectors, in heavy industry or long distance transportation. So that's why innovation is so important. The report we're going to hear a little bit more from David about today will make it clear how countries around the world are investing in the innovations we need to fight climate change and capitalize on the opportunity, the greatest economic opportunity, Secretary Kerry says, since the Industrial Revolution, a multi-trillion-dollar economic opportunity as these markets are created. By 2030, if we're on track for net zero, countries will spend $4 trillion every single year on clean energy. And so seizing this opportunity will require proactive government action and action by the private sector. As we all know, it'll take increased investment in research, development, and demonstration, and we'll have to create those early demand pull signals, those early markets for clean energy technologies across a range of areas. Let me say a couple words about the President Biden's administration's innovation priorities, because they make it clear that innovation is at the heart of the US's climate strategy. President Biden announced early on in the American Jobs Plan that he was calling for quadrupling investment in clean energy RD&D, which, by the way, was music to my and David Hart's ears. In Energizing America, the book we published in 2020, we called for tripling federal RD&D funding. Right? We called for a number of $25 billion a year by 2025, and President Biden has called for $35 billion a year. On the international stage, President Biden has not only rejoined the Paris Agreement, but he announced the US next year, after we get through this important COP26 this year, next year is going to be the United States' year of clean energy deployment and innovation. We're going to host the Clean Energy Ministerial. We're going to host the Mission Innovation Ministerial, that grouping that was launched in Paris in 2015 and will now be reinvigorated at COP26 with US leadership. And the Department of Energy has launched an exciting initiative called the Energy Earthshots Initiative. And the Energy Earthshots set goals for key emerging breakthrough technologies that we don't really have at commercial scale or cost yet. They include long duration storage, the goal to cut the cost by 80% or 90% by 2030. Clean hydrogen, cut it by 80% by 2030 to $1 per kilogram, making it competitive with fossil fuels. And what's coming up at COP26, an Earthshot for carbon dioxide removal. A mission innovation technology mission on carbon dioxide removal that the United States will lead. We also have already launched a shipping innovation mission with Denmark. And the United States is committed to the hydrogen technology mission. So a range of different technologies that we are supporting both on the domestic and the international stage. The last initiative I'll mention is that at COP26, President Biden and Secretary Kerry will launch the First Movers Coalition, which complements all of these public sector initiatives by bringing private companies together to make voluntary commitments that are super ambitious. For the first time across these hard to abate sectors, steel, cement, shipping, aviation, trucking, chemicals, aluminum, and direct air capture, across all of these sectors, These companies will make commitments targeted at bringing emerging technologies to market. They'll commit to purchase, for example, a certain amount of zero carbon steel that you can't make unless innovators bring new technologies to market. These targeted demand pull signals from the private sector resemble what we did, for example, with advanced market commitments for vaccines or for commercial space flight that enabled innovators to say, hey, there's firm market demand if I make the investments in the next generation of technologies. So this gives you a sense of the diversity of ways the United States, in partnership with other countries, is supporting the next generation of technologies. I'll finally say next year is going to be critical. We are pivoting from this year, where we're trying to get countries and companies to make ambitious commitments to frame this decade of action. We're pivoting next year to actually doing that action. And the United States is going to play host to that action through the Major Economies Forum, Clean Energy Ministerial, and Mission Innovation. I look forward to the conversation, look forward to talking with Vijay now, and look forward to hearing from David about how the United States can continue to invest in its own innovative economy and help the world combat climate change through your Global Energy Innovation Index. Thanks so much for having me.
Varun, thank you. Thank you for those wonderful, inspiring words about where the U.S. can lead on this topic. We want to understand a little bit of context, if you don't mind. This is a pivotal moment for the climate conversation, but of course the innovation question is bigger and broader. It's economy-wide, what you're grappling with and what the president's agenda grapples with. Can you give us a sense of what you think are the resilient strengths of U.S. innovation? And what are the areas that need improvement or doubling down? We're about to hear from David about the global rankings, and it does show the U.S. is not number one. There are areas that need to improve. There are areas other economies and ecosystems do better. What do you think is the real enduring strength of American innovation that we need to double down on? And what needs to be filling in of the gap? Where do we need to do better?
Absolutely. Well, look, I'll appeal to some of David Hart's seminal work on the topic. David, for example, has argued that the United States historically has innovated here, but then produced there, where the early stage innovations, we are the world's leader in early stage innovation. And we are the world's leader in bringing technologies up to the point where then countries around the world are able to commoditize them. And that's something we've got to change. So appealing to some of, David's run a retrospective analysis of the solar industry, for example, and he's done work on long duration storage. I think it's all terrific. Going forward, the US not only has to build on its strengths in early stage innovation, continue to be the world's leading funder across universities, private companies, our crown jewel national laboratories, but we also have to then cross that chasm, connect our early stage innovation, these technologies, to the market scale up and the production right here at home in the United States so that we can seize the gains across the value chain. Now, look, we're not going to be autarkic. We're going to have to connect with our like-minded allies and partners to build supply chains that we can trust. But if ultimately we're going to compete with competitors such as China around the world, the US has to be much stronger, not only in the early stage innovation, but in later stage demonstration, creating the scale-up markets at home to demonstrate those technologies and deploy them, and then export them around the world. That's what we now are building the muscles to do. And I'll close by saying the Biden administration has launched a request for comments for a national clean technology export competitiveness initiative. We welcome comments from our partners in the private sector and from others in civil society on how the US can lead on this second stage of innovation that David's written so compellingly about. Thanks, Vijay.
Thank you so much. It's been wonderful having you with us and getting us off to such a good start today. Thanks, Varun. Great. So we've got a great setup. We see that where the leadership is wanting to take the United States. Let me turn to David to give us that context and fill us in on the results of the report.
Thanks, Vijay. And thanks again, Varun, for joining us today. I know time is very short between now and Glasgow, so we're grateful for those precious minutes. So I'm going to present the report now. Let me begin by saying that this is a collaborative project, and I want to first of all thank and acknowledge the work of Chad Smith, my co-author. Chad parachuted into this project at a relatively late date, and he performed miracles, not only collecting and analyzing the data, which would have been enough, but helping to reconceptualize the project and making it far better than it would have been otherwise. I also want to thank the rest of the clean energy team here at ITIF, and Kayleen Schreiber, who built a data visualization site for the project, which I hope everyone will have a look at. And finally, this project rests on a foundation that was set by Colin Cunliffe, our former colleague here, who is now with the Department of Energy's Policy Office. So this project, as the title states, seeks to assess national contributions to the global energy innovation system. And you might ask, well, why bother? Let me answer that in 3 stages, if I could have the next slide. So the first point, Varun has already made this point. This just provides the backup for his comment. The world won't be able to avert ever worsening climate change without innovation. We already see the consequences of climate change in the form of storms, floods, heat waves, and these impacts will become more intense unless we stop pouring greenhouse gases into the atmosphere. But many of the solutions that the world needs to reduce and ultimately eliminate greenhouse gas emissions are too expensive or perform too poorly, or simply aren't available yet. So this graphic is from the International Energy Agency's net zero by 2050 scenario. And in it, nearly half of the emissions reductions come from technologies that are not on the market today, much less in widespread use. So that's the data that Varun was sharing. Now, the fact that we need innovation, and again, I'm just echoing Varun's comment, the fact that we need innovation should not slow down deployment. We have solutions in hand for a lot of challenges, or we have solutions that are nearing maturity. And so we have to deploy and innovate at the same time. And in fact, these 2 things are complementary. Deployment and innovation reinforce and fuel one another. So we have to do both, and we need to do both with real urgency. Next slide, please. Second, why worry about the global system? The reason is that innovation is a social process advanced by organizations and communities that feed off of one another. And many of those entities, whether they are scientific disciplines, companies, markets for products and services, many of those innovation entities are global. So I've illustrated that here by borrowing a graphic from Greg Nemet's great book on the solar industry. And he describes that as kind of a relay race in improving the performance and lowering the cost of solar panels among several countries, the United States, Germany, Japan, and China. And many other nations also contributed to that success story of recent years. In the lower right, you see 3 Nobel Prize winners who were given the award for creating the lithium-ion battery. They're all from different countries. And then the last graphic, the map, is carbon capture and storage facilities. This recently came out from the Global CCS Institute, and it shows the distribution of these facilities around the world. And we want them to learn from one another so that each new generation of CCS technology is better than the next. Next slide, please. So energy innovation is a vital global process, but there's no global entity that watches out for it. And innovating in order to clean up the energy system is not something that the market will respond to because the incentive is not there. So that means governments, especially national governments, are the key players in driving global energy innovation. I use the image here of the Valley of Death, where great ideas and inventions fail before ever getting into widespread use. Now, I will admit that I have criticized this figure, and it's a metaphor that's hackneyed and overused, but nonetheless, it captures an essential truth. It takes a lot of money and effort to turn great ideas and inventions into products and services that we can all rely upon at an affordable price. Government investments and policies play a key role in bringing them through the Valley of Death, and that is especially so in energy, which is generally a commodity business that runs on tight margins, and yet provides services that are essential for almost everything we do. Next slide, please. So we need innovation to clean up our energy system. Innovation is a global process, and national governments are the main stewards of that process. But assessing how well the world is doing and how much nations are contributing is very hard. I won't go into this tale of woe, but I like the image here of the crumpled paper turning into a paper airplane as a metaphor for it. Rarely is innovation a linear process in which you have a clean sheet of paper that is folded up and then flies perfectly. More typically, it begins with some kind of apparent chaos out of which emerges order that turns out to perform a useful function when enough blood, sweat, and tears are poured into it. So to put it another way, innovation, especially innovation, is complicated, indirect, slow, involves tacit communications, has fuzzy categories, and so on. So it's really hard to measure. Next slide. But anyway, here's what we did under Chad's thoughtful leadership and drawing on the scholarly literature, as well as Collins Foundation, we developed a set of functions that the global energy system has to perform. They're captured in 3 broad groups that became the sub-indices that fed into the main index. The system needs knowledge to be developed and shared, so that's index number 1. The system needs to motivate entrepreneurs and existing businesses to innovate by sending powerful market signals. That's the second one. And it needs a social license to operate because energy technologies are embedded in and intrinsically linked to social and cultural systems. Then we sought reliable, longitudinal, internationally comparable data to compare these functions. And that was a very hard part, and Chad did the bulk of the work on that. Ultimately, we came up with 20 indicators. We sought to gauge not only their current level, but also recent changes in them in the spirit of next month's climate summit, which is taking stock of progress since the Paris Agreement in 2015. Most of the data are drawn from public sources, especially from the IEA and the OECD. But we also benefited from data on entrepreneurship and entrepreneurial finance that was provided by the Clean Tech Group, which is a private consultancy. The data aren't perfect, far from it, but as I said, it's a hard project and we welcome others to contribute. Next slide, please. So once we gathered the data, we had to standardize them and weight them. The data are quite diverse, and so are the 34 countries included in the index. They're big, they're small, and so on. So I just wanted to show you a piece of the weighting scheme. This is the Knowledge Development and Diffusion subindex. It's the most straightforward of the 3 sub-indices, and it uses measures that will be familiar to innovation scholars. We weighted this subindex at 40% of the total, and it's made up of 3 categories. Public investment in low carbon energy R&D, knowledge generation, and invention. And then each of the last 2 categories are made up of 2 indicators each. And then within them, you have level and change. So these columns correspond to the layers on the previous slide. And then when you multiply across them, you get the weightings for each indicator within the index as a whole. So that's in the far right column. You can see that public investments in low carbon energy R&D get 20% of the weight in the index. And that's the most of any. And 10% each for publications and inventions broken down as you see. So obviously, this is a step that involves a lot of judgment on our part, and we know that others might disagree or want to try out other weightings. And we invite that discussion. In fact, on our data visualization site, there's a feature that lets you play around with the weightings. And if you're a power user, you can download the data from our site and do more extensive reweighting. Okay, next slide, please. So what's the result of all that work? Here are the top 4 countries on the list: Finland, Denmark, Sweden, and the UK. All of them had the same rank when we look at the 2016 data, except for the UK, which came up 5 places. Now, these aren't countries that make the biggest contributions in absolute terms, but when the data are standardized and scaled by GDP or population, they are making the biggest contribution relative to their potential. Next slide, please. So the next tier is also dominated by Europe, along with Canada, Switzerland, Belgium, Netherlands, Germany, Canada, France, and Norway, which came up the most since 2016. Next slide, please. And then the third tier, with the United States coming in 17th. So there are 34 countries in total. The US is just barely in the top half. And it fell the most between 2016 and 2021. And I think if Arun and his colleagues are successful, they will turn that ranking around when we do this again in a few years. Next slide, please. So one of the most interesting things that our approach reveals is that countries excel or do poorly in different areas. Finland doesn't lead across the board, but it does top the second sub-index on entrepreneurial experimentation and market formation. And you can see that the knowledge index is led by Denmark and the social index is led by the UK. Next slide, please. For those of you who are wondering about the United States, here's a snapshot from our data visualization, which includes a page on each country. The 2016 rankings are in blue, and the 2020 rankings are in orange. So when you overlay those 2, if there's a lot of blue showing, that means the orange, the 2021 rankings are lower than the 2016. And so you can see there's been a lot of retrenchment. The biggest gaps are in the category number 8. That's national commitments. That's at sort of 8 o'clock on the dial as you're looking at it. This is a component of our social legitimation and international collaboration subindex, and it reflects the Trump administration's pullout from the Paris Agreement, especially. But there's also some blue showing in the upper right, numbers 2 and 3, which cover publications and inventions. It's worth bearing in mind as you consider this that the rest of the world, especially Europe, didn't sit still in these years. The scoring in the index is relative. So even if a country is increasing its contributions, it will fall back in the rankings if others are doing so faster. Next slide, please. So it's a really rich report, and I can't do it full justice here. I hope you'll read it and explore the data visualization, as we're going to continue to do. But just to give a taste of a few other findings, I've already demonstrated that there's a lot of variation within countries' profiles, and that's not necessarily a bad thing if countries aren't all doing poorly in the same way. It might even be good if countries' activities complement one another. So if some countries are good at generating ideas and others at providing markets, those can be complementary. Second, we find that the rankings are pretty stable and over time and across the different weightings. Now, in this report, we don't provide an assessment of the global system. We are working on that, but it can provide some insights. Certain indicators can be aggregated up to the global level. Overall, we argue that there is a lack of urgency. Innovation isn't getting the attention that it needs to from the world as a whole. And we hope that's something that the delegates to the conference in Glasgow will take note of and do something about. And I was encouraged to hear the Biden administration's plans in this regard. So for instance, global public investment in low carbon energy R&D, as you add it all up and then scale it by the size of the economy, it's basically been flat for the 5 years. So absolute numbers have risen, but not as a share of the economy. Carbon pricing around the world, which provides a market incentive for firms to cut emissions and innovate, has only done slightly better. And there are other indicators in this vein. But it's not all bad news. There are some bright spots, and notably, startup and entrepreneurship has really been thriving. So if we use the venture capital investment as an indicator, that's gone up about 25% per year as a share of GDP since 2016. Next slide, please. So that's my presentation. Thanks for listening. I'm looking forward to the discussion. And again, I just would encourage all of you to have a look at the report, have a look at the visualization, which includes the spider chart for each of the 10 categories. And of course, thank you all for joining us. And with that, I will throw it back to Vijay.
Thank you, David, for a fascinating presentation. I know you'll be joining us for the round robin a little bit later, but let me use the moderator's prerogative to ask you a question right off the bat, if you don't mind. You're an old hand at this topic of innovation policy, national competitiveness. Was there anything in this analysis or study that surprised you? What did you learn?
Yeah, I was impressed with the showing that Europe made, as a whole. Now, obviously, it wasn't every country, but the kind of core countries in the European economy are shifting towards clean energy innovation. And we've often been critical of Europe, we Americans, as sort of lagging on that front. But it's always been a mixed picture. There have been areas where Europe has led, and I think in energy they've really stepped up, and that's very encouraging. And it reflects the rhetoric coming from Brussels, but it's backed up by the data.
So that begs a second question. I would argue that the fact that Europe is green is not really a big shock to anybody. That's pretty well known around the world. Environmental movements, green parties, German subsidies for solar and so on are a big part of the last 20 years. But it's one thing to have top-down policies that promote environmentalism, and it's another more complicated question, like that crumpled piece of paper, to talk about innovation. And your index, of course, looks at innovation in energy, and you bring those two things together. How much do you think is an artifact of the index weighting the role of government strongly, that is public support for energy R&D, for example, given the market failures and externalities we all know about in energy? How much of this is really the fact that in energy, innovation might require a stronger public role is why we're seeing Europe rise and the US fare less well on the index?
I do think there's something to that. As you said, energy is a little bit different from other sectors where government needs to play a bigger role, especially to kind of break out of the incumbent control that we've seen. But it's not entirely based on government. I think we see a number of European countries doing very well in the startup area, and many of their established companies as well, sort of shifting to a green energy transition. So I think there are both going on. I think it is fair to say that government has taken a lead and pushed harder in Europe, and the US has lagged in part because the Trump administration wasn't really interested in moving the ball forward. But I think European society has responded as well. And many countries do well across the board in our index.
Great. Well, thank you. That gets us going. Let me turn to Amy first for your comments. Amy, give us your perspective on this topic.
Well, I mean, the study, my congratulations to ITIF on providing just this wealth of data and analysis. I guess my first observation with Denmark coming in the lead is that, of course, Denmark has been very successful in innovating in the wind sector, in turbines and other things. And the lesson of Denmark maybe is that a government that can consistently back large demonstration projects can create a successful innovation ecosystem. So I don't want to downplay that, but in thinking about, does that hold lessons for the US or does that hold lessons for the global South? I think we have to look a little bit more critically at the fact that we're talking about a very wealthy nation where public goods like health insurance and so forth are already handled. And that's not true in the majority of the world that's trying to create ecosystems. So we have to keep in mind this new pressure that the transition should be a just one. So, the Biden administration is on top of this idea. DOE is looking back at how to propel large-scale demonstrations in nuclear, in CCS, and hydrogen, as Varun mentioned. But we also have to be cognizant of the fact that a solid demonstration can take 7 years. And we don't have 7 years. And so we really need to think about, not only in the United States, but also in other countries, how to create this innovation ecosystem. So our research shows a couple of things. Number one, we do think that mission innovation has been very successful. To go outside the Western world, Chile and Mexico met their commitments to double their R&D spending. That put them in line with themselves in Brazil to have a giant rise in scientific publications since they joined Mission Innovation. We're seeing, though, that a lot of money that's spent in energy innovation comes from the state enterprises in a lot of countries. And we know that some of that money is still going into research on oil and gas drilling and other fossil fuel technologies. And maybe we need to see more pivot in that regard. You're starting to see some pivot in the Chinese SOEs, and even Gazprom is starting to say it's going to invest in renewables, and Saudi Aramco is looking at hydrogen and ammonia. So I do think there needs to be some emphasis when we're looking outside the OECD at what is the role of state enterprise. But then more generally, I think one of the things that our research has shown on creating an ecosystem for innovation in the developing world is that this idea that the lessons that, or the paradigms that are maybe being used in Europe don't really apply. And that sometimes countries make a mistake to try to bring European countries to their country to innovate, when really they could be developing their own local systems through different means, working with their own universities and creating systems where we found in Latin America, for example, some of the most successful innovators were the next generation, younger generation of a family where the family had already been successful in some other industry, and they're able to self-finance a younger generation member who's been educated in innovation to move forward. So I think that this question of, it's not one size fits all. We need to come up with paradigms specifically for the developing world. And let me finish by saying that the sort of China model of development, which was borrowed from the sort of Japan, South Korea model of development, where we would have massive employment come about by doing giant infrastructure projects that require coal, steel, and cement, road building and bridge building and so forth, steel as an industry. This is no longer a good path to economic growth. In fact, we know, like looking at India and other countries, that this idea that a sort of a green industrialization paradigm could combine with just transition capabilities could really be more enhancing of the long-term economy in those countries. And you see countries like Indonesia talking about putting in a carbon price and so forth. So we need to take that into account. And last point, in the US, we've done some analysis of the loan guarantee program and the tax credit program. I think more thought needs to go into the United States about how we use metrics for deciding. So successful demonstrations in utility scale solar in the United States based on the loan guarantee program in the 2009-2011 period. But almost all that money went to California, a little bit to Nevada and Arizona. What about the rest of the country? So we really need to be thinking about, again, how the United States creates ecosystems, not just where there already is a successful ecosystem, but in places where we need to create new opportunities.
That's great. Thank you, Amy. I particularly appreciate you talked about experiences outside of the US and Europe. You mentioned Latin America, where your team has done work. And we had heard about hydrogen from Varun. I know that Chile, for example, has aspirations to become a hydrogen exporting superpower with green hydrogen. And not only is it a different model, but they're also using innovative public policy. They're holding tenders for production of hydrogen on public lands because it can take a lot of land to develop the solar power to create the exportable hydrogen and so on. So we're seeing interesting new models of public-private collaboration and policy emerge. We'll talk more about that in our discussion, I'm sure. Let me turn to Peter. Peter, can you give us your perspective?
Thank you so much, Vijay. And yeah, so I mean, as David said, the energy innovation itself is global, but of course the targets need to be set on a national level. And it seems to us, again, also from this report, comparing it also to the 2019 edition, that changing the innovation system of nations is a slow business. So half the nations have moved less than 3 places up or down in the 2021 report. And changing direction in the energy innovation strategy of nations seems to us a little bit like navigating an aircraft carrier. And so I think what we can take away from it is, of course, you need to define the target as regional, as a nation, collect the best practices. And as Amy pointed out, you need to compare yourself to the right peer group. So if we take Germany, there are a couple of European nations in terms of the industrial backbone. And so you can compare in a way, but then there's limits to it. And each of the nations has to find their own way. And so I think mission innovation and other initiatives play a very important role in getting the hard-to-abate sectors that Varun alluded to rolling. And in practice, if we take a look at Germany and Europe, some European nations have done very well, but there's a lot to be improved. And if we take the German perspective within the EU regulation, we perceive there's a lot of good intentions across the board to get boots on the ground and to get these technologies going. But basically, from our perspective, 2 things need to go hand in hand. And the first thing is the ecosystem for the innovator has to be improved all the way from TRL 1 to TRL 9. So we really have to see across all innovation stages, and the one, or we would argue the 2 valleys of death across the stages, that innovators are best served. And the second part is that the market design and the regulation has to adapt in the national and in the EU market, in our case, to these new kinds of technologies that are coming up. And I'd like to add 1 or 2 examples per case. One is that take Germany and the ecosystem for innovators. We have very slow procedures in Germany in terms of support for startups, support for innovators, R&D consortia. And anyways, it takes a very long time. Sometimes you need a consultant to really do the paperwork for one of these applications. And so what we would wish for is to take like a customer journey perspective on this application process for grants and make them more flexible, make them a lot quicker, and benchmark the most successful programs, again, of your peer group to improve the support you're giving to the kind of innovators you want to support. And then the second part, or the second half of this, is that you need to measure results. Amy has pointed to this as well. So you need to measure the success, and you must not only measure it in the entrepreneurial space with the innovators, the startups, but you must also have a look at your R&D consortia. What comes out of it? How is this feeding? How is this supporting the cause of the energy transition? And then to add an example on the market design, the kind of regulation, for example, if we take the electricity markets, need to change drastically. And so to not only have to make the innovators successful to the early TRLs and help them survive there, but if they want to really grow into the mass market has to be ready for this. And an example for this with a lot of market barriers is digital tools. Germany is not ready for applying digital tools in electricity markets yet. I mean, the rollout of the smart metering system, you might have heard about it, has been a mess, frankly speaking. And the same holds true in a second step for using distributed ledger technologies such as blockchain to allow for bilateral, multilateral trading in the long term. So a lot lies in these things, as Varun has said in the keynote, of the First Movers Coalition. So where the public procurement side must not be underestimated. It can have a very strong effect. And finally, especially in Germany, but in other countries in Europe as well, we really have to reduce the bureaucratic aspects of supporting startups in this. We need to get quicker, we need to become more flexible, and we need to, like, the public side has to think of themselves as service providers for the innovators and recreate the markets for these technologies. Thank you.
Peter, thank you. You could have taken the opportunity of a lot of European countries coming at the top of the rankings to gloat, but you were gracious and self-critical, pointing out the weaknesses in the European innovation ecosystem as well, from which we can all learn. So I'm sure that is an edifying contribution to which we'll pick up in a moment. Let me open this up. Let me invite Amy and David back into the conversation. And let me pick up on a point you made, Peter, about some of those digital opportunities, but also weaknesses that you identify in Europe. As it so happens, we have an expert on energy's digital future joining us on this panel, who's written a book, an excellent book that I recommend to all of you on this very topic. Amy, would you tell us how should we think about the role that digital technologies should play in energy innovation?
Well, I mean, digital technology has a huge potential, has a potential in optimization and energy efficiency programs, has, especially in transportation, which we haven't seen. Peter mentioned its possibility in building efficiency. But all of this, as Peter mentioned, requires proper market design and regulation. When we think about 5G and data, the energy, electricity issues are not just, snap dunk. And we need to actually have thoughtful regulation. We're seeing some forward-looking regulation in California. They just came out with a new law that says that automated vehicles by 2030 have to be zero emission vehicles to be able to be in a ride-hailing system. So that's a big improvement. Should be something that globally countries should look at. But I think the most important point, and I agree that public spending needs to be involved, but in the end, the R&D budgets of companies like Google and Apple are huge, and they're looking at Microsoft, and they're looking at these kind of products that Amazon that can really propel carbon savings. And the question is, how to tap that momentum and build on it, either through public-private partnerships or how to use market stimulation and regulation to get them to build those technologies in a way that meets society's goals. So give you an example of an Amazon, and then I'll stop talking. If Amazon uses optimization programs and goes to zero emission vehicles, then using e-commerce could be very enabling for lowering emissions. But you could imagine if people want to demand 1 hour delivery, you could imagine that Amazon, which is something they thought about in the past, could have these sort of mobile warehouses which is the goods that they've used big data to determine that on October 25th, everybody in New York City starts thinking about boots, and they could have some vehicle circling the city with boots on it so they could bring you your boots in an hour. Well, that would be highly polluting. And we know from major cities that package delivery is the major contributor to congestion, wasted fuel, and emissions. So it's really, in my view, the fact that these technologies can do an amazing job at helping us get to our climate goals doesn't mean they will, unless we have the regulatory muscle to move them in that direction.
Great. So let's pick up on that, David. Digital technologies, huge promise, huge potential, but clearly could be a double-edged sword. How do you think about it from a systems perspective?
Yeah, I agree. I think it's the backbone. It's the underappreciated backbone of the energy transformation. And I basically endorse Amy's thesis, which is we need smarter regulation in order to enable that process. Now, some of that is macro, right? We have to make it expensive to use dirty energy or make it uncomfortable to use dirty energy. But we also have to reward, the payoffs from the investments in these digital platforms or control devices or whatever it may be. I mean, digital covers an enormous spectrum of technology opportunities. So I think it's something that countries need to be paying attention to, and it's a little bit different across each sector. So utility sector is going to be different from transportation, but there are opportunities to use digital technologies to accelerate the green revolution across the whole economy.
Thank you. I wanted to pick up on another one of the themes that's been put on the table today, and that is the role of venture capital and early stage funding of energy innovation. I think in the report, David, you highlighted in one of your slides that venture capital has been increasing in, broadly speaking, clean tech, or as it's called, climate tech space these days. And Peter, you talked about the questions about VC in Europe as well. My question to all three of you is this. I'm old enough and have the gray hairs to prove it that I lived through the clean tech boom of, let's say, a dozen years ago, as well as the clean tech bust that came shortly thereafter, where there was an enormous amount of money and interest from Silicon Valley, particularly, and some of the leading lights of Silicon Valley pouring money into the space. And by and large, it was seen as a failure. Now, we can always pick nits in that argument, say that, well, we learned a lot, and there's a cadre of experienced founders, and sure, but in fact, it did not succeed as hoped. Most companies went bust. Venture capitalists lost an awful lot of money. And one of the lessons people sometimes take away from that is this is a form of finance, that is early stage risk capital, that is ill-suited to energy, which tends to have very long payout periods. That is, it takes a long time to develop these hard technologies, a decade or more sometimes, unlike the quick turns that VCs like to have. And also, it's a commodity business. Often you're selling to a utility where they're not going to pay for something sexy or snazzy or risky. They want something de-risked, project finance, and you need a different kind of finance. So why are we talking about venture capital again? Can someone make the case or why this is interesting or important in energy?
Well, let me kick it off. So I just want to reference that Varun's paper is the one that I always cite on this topic. So just to give him credit for that on the topic of the clean tech bust and the mismatch. I'm a little mystified myself, but I do think the big dollars are going into transportation, both into cars and to batteries. And I think the thesis is that this is a giant market that's going to be disrupted, and that these companies are positioning themselves the way the big tech companies did to the telecom companies in the past. So I don't know whether that thesis will play out, but I do welcome, there is always boom and bust in venture capital. There's no reason to think that pattern will change. But usually when the boom washes away, there's something very valuable left behind. And it's the messiness of our system of creative destruction.
Let me just add one thing that I think needs to be clarified here. The United States government tried to pick a winner in biofuels, and the Silicon Valley companies glommed into that, and everybody tried to do biofuels, and it all failed, and everybody lost a lot of money. So, if you look at a different industry, for example, through mission innovation,
Peter, do you want to jump in briefly?
The wind industry,
Sure.
number of patents went up 65% since mission innovation began.
Okay, should I add
Amy,
something?
let's hold off just a
Vijay?
moment. Let's hear from Peter. We'll come back to you when the ringing stops. Go ahead, Peter.
That's great. I mean, Vijay, I think you're mentioning something extremely important, this whole boom and bust period, the whole, whatever you want to frame it, 2005 to 2011 or something, where like all these VC expectations were not met. But when comparing it with software, with pharmaceutical and these industries where within 5 years you get, like one unicorn per 10 investees or something. And I think a problem we're still running after, even though now a lot more VCs flooding into the market again, is the narratives it created on some points that were mentioned by David and yourself, like the capital intensive, long-lasting asset sort of characteristics of clean tech, especially hardware clean tech, of course. And it's very important. And then there was the Solyndra failure, and Obama got, like big problems, President Obama. And so it's very important to now create the counter narratives again, showing that this can be successful for venture capital investments. And I think there's a lot of willingness there, and also new kinds of financial, carriers or tools that are being developed that are more appropriate to these sometimes hybrid, sometimes very hardware-focused, capital-intensive clean tech.
Can you give one example of an innovative financing mechanism that you see that's new, since you're alluding to them? What's new?
Well, what's new is of course all kinds of mezzanine versions where public-private combinations are used. Where I don't know how new this is technically, but it's new to the sector in a sense that the public side takes the first boss. But that's definitely the need to double down and to involve the private capital. It's no use just having the public side. So that would be one.
Great, that's a good point. Amy, let's come back to you to finish your point.
Well, I think the point is that, part of it, honestly, is how does, say, a government like the US government or the German government evaluate where to put public money and who to back? So I think the German Development Bank was more successful because it partnered with local community banks in Germany, and therefore you got sort of a fairer distribution. You got it. You got parties that were known. It helped, of course, rooftop solar get going in Germany. So I think in the United States, just to give an example, but also maybe appropriate for other countries, you mentioned Chile and others that are starting to make headway, having the structure of a national development bank that can then work with widely distributed institutions. So we know from the 2009 stimulus that those states that had their own green bank did better with federal funds than states that didn't. We know from talking to the private sector here in the United States that companies based in Chicago and some other places that do VC, by going into the local university systems and specifically marketing to underrepresented groups and women entrepreneurs, outperform some of the VCs that are just, handshaking with the same 5 people they've been dealing with forever. So, restructuring these public finance tools in the United States and in other countries so that you're getting a broader representation of society, and that you're widening the opportunity from diversifying it from these sort of known elites, because, the known elites have not delivered everything that we need. And so, let's think about how to do this more broadly, and that would fit better with our need in most countries to come up with what we call green industrialization. So a plan where, it is going to deliver jobs and it is going to bring prosperity, across the society. And again, not just to some small elite of people who are going to 1 or 2 institutions or 5 institutions, et cetera.
To follow up on that, you've mentioned there are some states with green development banks that have done well. given what we know about how Washington works, do you think a national green development bank, which is an idea being floated, could work in the United States?
I absolutely think it can. It's in the, I don't know if it's in the reconciliation bill or the other bill.
It's in the air in Washington.
It's in the air. It's called the Clean Energy Accelerator. And I think it's a must do. And I think that the power of it, as opposed to the loan guarantee program or even the SBIR program out of DOE, is that it can work with community banks, which is something we know worked well in Germany. And I think would work even better in the United States because, you know, J.B. Straubel started in a garage and now he has a new innovative company that's going to recycle cobalt from your phone and computer and, you know, provide the car industry that way. So we know that we want to find innovators, you know, everywhere and not just in one location and you know, in, I won't say the elite schools, right? So it really is the right way to go. And I think that other countries, you know, could benefit it from well. It's certainly worked well in China, though that bank has had its own set of some of those development banks have had their own set of bankruptcies that might mirror what the United States happened in VC and biofuels. But, you know, in the end, it gives you more leverage to bring in different kinds of parties into the system. And I think that's really the power of it.
We're running low on time, but I do want to take a question from the floor that's come in. Which countries are causing the biggest innovation spillovers to developing countries and the rest of the world? What are they doing right? Maybe David, since you've just looked across a number of countries, could you give us a response to that?
Yeah, it's a hard question. I'm not sure I've got data directly on that because we would need to sort of drill down into the partnerships and see. But I do think the dropping cost of renewables is probably at the moment the biggest contribution in terms of cutting emissions in developing countries, at least in the the next few years.
Shouldn't we give China the credit for that and the German taxpayer?
I think they deserve some of it. I think the U.S. deserves some of it as well. As I said, it's kind of been a global process, but no question that Chinese investments, state-sponsored investments, I would say, and I have a paper that criticizes some of that for its impact on innovation in the rest of the world. But I do think dropping the cost has been a really big contribution to allowing developing countries to develop new paths for their energy systems. As Amy said, it's really important that their evolution not mirror those of the existing high-income countries. They have to have a different development pathway, and it needs to be built around fundamentally different sources of energy.
Any quick thought of this from either of you, Peter or Amy?
Well, I would just add, my opinion is Mission Innovation has been a very successful institution. It's encouraged countries to step it up in a way that maybe they wouldn't have had they not been members. I would encourage the United States, if they're hosting it, as Varun mentioned, at the next ministerial, to try to use Glasgow to get more countries to sign into Mission Innovation. And then think about how to use Mission Innovation as a platform for multinational public-private partnerships. So, and in digital, a lot of dual use, so very hard to collaborate in certain things. Maybe we're not going to be willing to collaborate in advanced nuclear, or we're not going to be willing to, on digital electricity technologies. There's always the cyber concerns. But if you look at things like carbon sequestration, electrolyzers, some of these other technologies where we really need to dramatically lower the costs, that's something where the United States and other countries, China, can work together to really globalize the effort and really bring down the cost for some of these technologies that could be very important going forward.
We're just out of time, but I'm going to put you on the spot. Lightning round. If this study is done again in 5 years, what country is going to come number one? We're going to ask you to take a guess. I'll start with you, Peter. Come to Amy and close off with David. I'm not going to hold you to this, but just to have a bit of fun at the end of our session. Peter.
Well, following the advice everybody's just been giving, and you've been alluding to the feed-in tariff system, the EEG. If we learn quick enough, and if we adapt quick enough, and if we're technology open, I'd say Germany.
Okay, all right. Amy, what do you think?
Well, I feel like since Peter went in that direction, I have to say it could be the United States. And I would say that with the right incentives, I think that our private sector is really looking at a lot of innovation. And I don't know whether David's survey, takes that system into account, but I still think that, even with all the success that's come from government directed activity in different countries, there's nothing, if you just snap off the top of your head, you want to come up with some named inventions that are making a huge difference and the brand that's associated with them, I might offer the possibility that you're probably talking about a US brand in many cases.
Okay, so an aspirational Germany and an aspirational United States. David, what do you say? You're the Wizard
Yeah.
of Oz.
So my heart says the United States, but we know that better should never follow their hearts. And as Peter said, and I've written extensively on this, innovation systems are slow-moving beasts. So if I had to put money down, I'll bet on Sweden, Denmark, and Finland. And I don't know if I could bet the trifecta in exact order, but I would take them as the top three. And more power to them. They're making great contributions, and everybody should emulate that, even though it's hard.
Okay, very good. I'm going to have to draw our gathering to a close on that, but at least we had a chance to get a glimpse into the innovation future. I want to thank all of you for joining us today for this lively conversation, and thanks, of course, to our panelists and our special guest. The recording of this conversation will be available on YouTube and the ITIF website, of course. Have a great day, everyone.